Hey, leaders. In this episode of Building a Culture of Collaboration, I'm honored to be joined by David Burkus, a former business school professor turned full-time writer and speaker. We're going to talk about his book, Best Team Ever, and learn more about the three fundamental elements all high-performing team cultures share. So let's get started.
Intentional and purposeful focus on building a culture of collaboration is the secret for leaders striving to make a difference. In building a culture of collaboration, Kurtis and Hewson will share simple tips, ideas, and strategies to take your organization's collaborative efforts to the next level.
Welcome to Building a Culture of Collaboration. As always, I'm Kurtis Hewson, co-founder and lead learner of Jigsaw Learning, and today I'm joined by David Burkus, award-winning author of 5 best-selling books, as well as others, and about business and leadership, and has been recognized multiple times as one of the world's top business thought leaders. Today, we really want to dig into the book, Best Team Ever, and I have my copy right here, David, and learn how we can ensure high-impact cultures of collaboration for our own organizations. So thanks so much for joining here today, David. Really honored to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And we had mentioned off camera before, Tulsa is where you're joining in from today. How are things in Tulsa on this? I guess we're recording on a Monday in June or a Tuesday in June.
Yeah, it's hot.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was in Dubai working with a corporate client last week, and everybody told me ahead of time, "Oh, you're going to Dubai in June. It's gonna be hot. It's gonna be hot." It's pretty much the same temperature as it is here in Tulsa.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
we have a lot more grass, but other than that, same temperature, same humidity. So that's what it is.
Yeah, you were acclimatized before you went. I had one, and so as I shared, we're in Alberta, Canada, right in central Alberta. And we had one time where we went to work with some schools in Australia where when we left, it was right close to minus 40 degrees Celsius here. And when we landed, it was 30 degrees Celsius. That 70-degree shift was massive.
Well, you know, it's funny you say minus 40 Celsius, because that's actually where it flips to same temperature Fahrenheit too.
Yeah.
That's where they intersect. And I always think of that because I think of minus 40 as like the temperature, the thermometers just give up at that point.
Yeah.
They're just like, it's cold, we quit. Because it doesn't matter which system you're in at that point. They're like, it's too cold to be out.
Yeah, absolutely. So David, what drew me to being able to reach out and see if you'd be available to join for a conversation was this book, Best Team Ever. And now, is this the latest book that you've had out? Is this your most recent publication?
Yes, yeah. So that came out about a year and 2 months ago when folks will be listening to this. So it's the one we're still talking a ton about. It's, you know, as an author, everybody always tells you like, well, which one's your favorite? And your answer is always like the newest one because it's the new shiny one. And that's still true here. It's still so new that's, I mean, I like my other ones too. They're like kids. You can't really pick a favorite, but you know, in terms of books, yeah, that's the new one, the one we love talking about, and the one that's gaining a lot of traction, which I'm grateful for.
Well, it was interesting too, because when I took a look back through some of your library, this idea of talking about teams is not new. You focused on remote teams was one, and you know, managing dynamics of teams. But I'd really like to start off with what initiated your interest in exploring teams through multiple publications, but then this one in particular.
Yeah. It is sort of the through line through all of my work. I think, I think 2 reasons. One, or I guess the same reason, but in 2 parts. One, I think work is too important to our lives. You know what I mean? Like if you think back, I remember, I think it was John Maynard Keynes that said, like, by the year 2000, people will only be working 15 hours a week and machines and automation will do the rest of it. Like, yeah, well, good luck there.
Yeah.
And now, now we talk about it in the world of AI. And I think still like, actually, like humans like to make a contribution. It's psychologically healthy to be working on something. Now we can argue how much and for how much pay and all of those sort of things, but fundamentally, most of us want. So work is kind of central to our lives. It's a huge chunk of our regular weeks. It has spillover effects into all of the other spheres of our lives. If you have a bad day at work, it's going to be really, really hard to have a great day with your family, right? So work is central. And teams are central to work. Work is teamwork at this point. All of the easy problems have basically been solved. Even in education, team teaching and multi-age classrooms and all sorts of things that have been far more collaborative than the traditional model we think of in the 50s, 60s, 70s of one teacher to every 30 students, and that's the only interaction you get. Like, no.
In education, you can't do it alone. It's
right.
Not a possibility.
Exactly. And even the students are now being taught in pods, desks together, teams, etc. So work is central to our lives and teams are central to our work. So I feel like it makes it really, really important to get this one right.
Yeah.
And in fact, when you look at things like employee engagement data, when you look at employee experience, etc., and you tease it all out, what you're actually looking at is individuals' perception of what it's like to work on the teams they're on. If I gave, whatever organization I work with, when I ask about employee engagement, they often give me the averages and the average like per question, with this, we scored a 70% on this question. And right away I say, I'm not interested in that because you're thinking too broadly. Most people are answering, reflecting on these questions, thinking about the team that they're on. And so I'm interested in that team level data because that's their experience. And so that's really the goal. I think company culture is really just the aggregate of each individual team culture. Engagement is really just a reflection of how engaged you are with the team. And so that's where, if we want to drive real change, create more meaningful work, create a better employee experience, building collaboration, right? If we want to do that, we need to look at the team level. Yeah. So that's where my focus has been.
Okay, well, let's jump right in there. One of the first things that I had noted within the book, and the second I read it, I went, I think Michael Jordan said something like that. So I had to go back and check. And Jordan once had a quote that said, talent wins games, but teamwork wins championships. And when I had read what you had written, talent doesn't make the team makes the talent. I saw that connection there. So can you explain to myself and our viewers, listeners, what do you mean by that particular quote?
Yeah, and basketball is a great example for reasons we'll dive into in a second. But okay, so if collaboration and teamwork is central to work, right? Then all things being equal, I would prefer to hire talented individuals, right? Talented and motivated individuals, but all things are not equal, first of all. But second of all, talent isn't directly correlated to performance. Right? When we look at the research, Boris Groysberg at Harvard does an amazing job teasing out this data. When we look at the research in most knowledge work jobs, talent only explains about 40% of the variance in actual performance. Someone's knowledge, skills, and abilities and past experiences don't even predict the majority of what makes for actually producing results in that year. The other 60% is, surprise, surprise, the team you're on, the resources you have access to, and maybe some other factors, again, outside of that talent. So we drive in and we look at this in the context of individuals. I like to think of talent as, it's funny, I'm in Oklahoma and you're in Alberta. So let's use fuel, right? You look at something like oil, gasoline, et cetera, that is latent energy. Right? It was just sitting there in the ground, totally useless until we figured out a way to convert the stored energy in there into something, the internal combustion engine, and other things. And of course, we created all sorts of problems along the way. I'm not trying to minimize those, but my point is that talent is sort of like that. Talent is latent performance, dormant performance, and it needs an engine to be turned into results. That engine happens to be the team, the people you're collaborating with, the resources you have access to, the support that you can get. All of that is what makes that. And it's interesting because basketball is a great example of this. Different sports have different levels of, let's call it interdependence, right? Yeah. Baseball is a pretty solo sport, except for when you're fielding. Basketball is 100% interdependent all the time. And you look at somebody, not like a Michael Jordan, but if you look at, like, the example I always love to use is when LeBron James first went over to the Miami Heat. This was over a decade ago now. They were looking at, this is an incredibly stacked team. They are so talented. They're clearly going to win championships. Well, they didn't win a championship in the first year. They did in their second year. And the only thing that really changed in their second year was this really interesting addition of a non-superstar, a guy named Shane Battier. And Shane Battier was like the ultimate teammate. He has his stats. He doesn't show up fantastic in any of his stats, because stats are things like how many goals, how many assists, et cetera. But what's interesting is if you pull his numbers, star players on the Heat and the other teams that he's been on actually score more when Shane is on the court with them than when he's not. In
Mm.
other words, like the missing piece of the heat and the missing piece of a lot of things is essentially that teammateship, that ability to interact. Now, what's funny is I went through all of this, did the nerdy data-driven professor thing, looking through all of this, and then I explained it to a guy who used to be a high school basketball coach, and he goes, "Oh yeah, of course, one ball." I was like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, we preach one ball. There's one ball. Doesn't matter if there's 5 people on the court. There's one ball." And so you can't have all 5 of them have the ball at the same time. And as a team, you can't fight over that. You need to figure out who is the right person to have that ball in that moment. That's teamwork.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm reflecting on what you're sharing there, David, and obviously you're aware of that, the infamous Google project, the Project Aristotle,
Mm-hmm.
where you start with the hypothesis of, what makes a great team, as far as membership, but then realize that actually the membership didn't determine team success at all. It was how that team
Yeah.
interacted. So, when you think about those 3 fundamental elements that you talk in the book, you're really talking about how is the team working together. And you allude to common understanding, psychological safety, and pro-social purpose being those fundamental elements. So love a chance to be able to unpack these and what they mean
Yeah.
and what they look like. Let's start with common understanding. Or
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
even before we go there, David, how did you come up to determining it was those 3 in
Yeah, well,
mind?
I mean, interestingly enough, that you mentioned Project Aristotle, because that was a big. I think Project Aristotle is probably one of the best in vivo, meaning not in a lab, but actually out there, experiments on teams done ever. Now, unfortunately, it was done predominantly in a knowledge work setting, right? But still done massive in terms of sample size, multiple cultures represented, all in the same company, but multiple cultures, different time zones, et cetera.
Yeah.
Types of teams, co-located versus hybrid versus geographically dispersed, right? And they found essentially 5. They found culture made the difference, and they found
Yep.
5 elements of culture. And what I noticed when I read it, having been through the whole sort of PhD org psychology program, what I noticed is that their list of 5 was interesting and very, very aligned with other elements of data, but not like they just came up with, for example, the term sort of reliability, dependability, right? They just
Yeah.
sort of, that's their term. Okay, well, what are we actually talking about when we talk about that, right? Or psychological safety was a dead on, but they also talked about sort of meaning and impact. And like, okay, well, what do we know from data, other studies, and particularly stuff that's been well replicated and reproduced, et cetera? What do we know? So it was really an effort to take the existing body of lab-based and also in field experiments, combined with what I loved about Aristotle was the conciseness of it. Oh, it's just 5. Candidly, I don't know if I feel like in 2024, 5 is too many to remember anyway. But it was really meant on that same thing. If we combine what we see from field work with what we know from research, et cetera, what are we really talking about here? And that's where we ended up at the 3, sort of a
Yeah.
condensed version of the 5, a lot of overlap, but a lot more data than just that one study to rely on. So
Right.
common understanding that is a term that I sort of had to coin to combine a couple different things. First was the reliability, dependability element of Project Aristotle, which I call clarity. And the
Yeah.
second is kind of Anita Williams Woolley's concept around collective intelligence, that great teams sort of have this synergistic effect where the average, where the IQ output or the intelligence of performance on a cognitive test is higher than the average of each individual IQ, which I call in the book empathy because it's easier to sort of remember. So
Yeah.
common understanding is how well team members have a shared understanding of each other and their roles and responsibilities, how well they rely on people to actually deliver on those tasks. So I know what the whole team is doing, and I trust that that team is going to deliver on what they say they're going to do. But also, I know how to explain the behaviors of other people, and particularly their differences and their preferences and their personalities. And that's what helps me tap into what Woolley and others would call collective intelligence, what maybe Stephen Covey would call synergy, that idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That comes from a sense of empathy and understanding on the individual teammates. So we build that level of, often when we talk about empathy, you'll see in the data, they use the term shared understanding, but that's just on the empathy side. So I sort of moved to this common understanding, meaning do we have the same common objectives and common roles and responsibilities? And then do we have that sense of shared understanding about each other? And what I find is that most teams break down on the empathy side But it is possible to skew too much on the empathy and lose the clarity thing and have nobody actually know what they're supposed to deliver and what have you. Or in highly bureaucratic environments, highly slow moving environments, often, sort of government or nonprofit sector environments, it is the clarity side where things break down because people know that they're maybe not actually being tracked all that much in this giant bureaucracy, or that it takes forever to get through all of these different signatures. And so we just sit in waiting mode forever. So it's not a empathy or clarity are more important than each other. They work in tangent. How well does every member of the team know what's expected of them and know when to expect it? And also know what type of behaviors they're going to see from the other people and know how to speak the other person's language so that they can collaborate better as well. Clarity and empathy.
So for you speaking to a leader, what would you suggest could be something that I could be doing in my organization within the next month that would really help build up that common understanding foundational element or fundamental element for you? We'll be right back to continue this episode. We have all felt like this before when engaging in team meetings, feeling like our time is not being maximized or that this could have just been an email. As a leader, how can we ensure this is not the reality for everyone in the room? Rather than just simply coming together into a shared space, we really need to ensure that whenever we are engaging as a team in meetings, that the time is being utilized to its utmost and that we are truly seeing impact as a result of our conversations. My name is Kurtis Hewson, lead learner and co-founder of Jigsaw Learning. In this free on-demand webinar, I'm going to be sharing with you 5 planning considerations and then 5 facilitation considerations that you can put into place as a leader to take your team meetings to the next level. Access this webinar, and in addition to these 10 considerations, numerous free resources will be shared that you can begin using immediately. I can't wait to have you join me to learn how we can ensure that team meetings are having their optimal impact. And now back to our conversation.
So my absolute favorite activity to go through with teams is what I call the manual of me. I call it that because other people called it that. I don't know why I emphasize myself there. It's not a term I invented. Actually, in the book, I call it a teammate manual. And then I found after the book was published, there was a whole stream of people popularizing it under the term manual of me. But the concept is the same. Writer user's manual for what it's like to work with you. Yeah. Right. If you're a leader, you go first, right, and share yours out. But as a team building activity, we spend some time reflecting on and writing these manuals, and then spend some time sharing them out and discussing them. When I work with teams, I usually build them around a core of 4 questions, and then let the team decide if we want additional questions that are more background or that sort of thing. But the 4 questions they're all fill in the blank questions. I even have this little like 4x4 box where you put the answers to each, so you can make this own little map if you want. But the 4 questions are: I'm at my best when blank. Yeah. I'm at my worst when blank, right? So best meaning what types of activities are you really, really great at? What environments do you really thrive in? Just when and what types of work is your best, and what does it take to unlock that best work? Yeah. Same question in the reverse. What are the environments that really drain you? What are the types of tasks you really struggle with? Where are the places? It's a weaknesses question, right? Yeah. So 1 and 2 are strengths and weaknesses. Question 3, you can count on me to blank. In other words, here's the things I can deliver from the team. This is often where I give or where I go above and beyond, or ways in which I've helped teams in the past. And question 4, what I need from you, you meaning the team, is blank. In other words, this is where I often need help on a team. So you think about those 4 questions, right? Best, worst, give, and or help, and where I need help, right? How useful? First of all, some people don't even know their own answers to those questions because they've never taken the reflection time to do part of that self-reflection, right? Yeah. But how useful would it be to know the answers to those questions, especially as a leader and you're thinking through like a project you're working on? How useful would it be to know the answers to that when you're thinking through and divvying up tasks and who's going to work with who and what have you? Great teams. This is in the book too. This actually original quote comes from Marcus Buckingham. Great teams played chess, not checkers.
Yeah, I remember reading.
Right. And great leaders they do treat everyone equally, but they don't treat them the same. In checkers, every piece moves the same. It's a pretty boring game. Children play it, right? It's not all that dynamic. In chess, every piece moves a little bit differently, and you need to understand the complexities of that and also the opportunities that it creates. And in great teams, what we see is not a team that's great because everybody's strong in the same things and there's no weaknesses. We are humans after all. Great teams work because as a team, we know how to use individual strengths to offset individual weaknesses and keep the whole team strong. And so an exercise like a manual of me can really draw that out on the team, just by forcing the questions. And what I love about it is it's my favorite team building activity, and no one has to fall backwards into anyone else's arms.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it becomes a great, easy, and also very kind of acceptable and easy thing to take a team through as well.
This is often for me when you start to see validity in what's being shared is when you can draw replications to it. Like Ray Dalio talks about, each employee having a baseball card, but it's essentially the same type of understanding that how do I first reflect on when do I do my best work as a teammate, but then does everyone else understand that? And then especially from a leadership perspective, how do I strategically deploy that with a high degree of intentionality?
Yeah. And I think, the important thing is sharing it out and having a conversation, because the conversation, first of all, reveals more about ourselves. There may be things our teammates see as strengths of ours that we didn't even notice.
Of course.
But it also allows a little bit of sort of brutal honesty, if you will. Like, for example, I work with a lot of organizations where they're still working through what the perfect return to office is, how many days a week and who else needs to be around and what have you. And it's funny because when you do an exercise like Manual of Me, because remember, I'm at my best when you put the parameters on that. So that's not only the type of work you want to do, but maybe also the environment. And so you end up with like a lot of people who either admit that they do their best work around other people or don't, or sometimes you end up with people who say they do their best work working from home. And then you end up with a boss being able to be like, well, actually, no, I see a decline in your performance there. And let's have that conversation, right?
Yeah.
So it's super useful because you're sharing all those things with the team, but it's also really useful because in the compare and contrast between how you rate yourself and how your team sees you usually lies the truth of your performance. And so you get all of those insights on your own too.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm also thinking as you're explaining this, David, the high degree of vulnerability that comes with that, which then lends into that second fundamental element. And sorry, I don't mean to categorize these as 1, 2, 3. It's just the way I'm working through them based on the structure of the book of how critical the vulnerability is then for psychological safety. So talk to us a little bit about the critical need for psychological safety. And you're right, from that Project Aristotle, that was one thing that was absolutely nailed. Within that. And then how do we do that within our organization to really get to that stage of psychological safety with our teams?
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because if the activity, the Manual of Me activity that we just discussed sounds like, oh my God, my team would never actually do that or would never be honest with themselves of doing it. Well, that hints at a problem in the psychological safety side. So maybe we start there before we do the Manual of Me, right? Textbook definition of psychological safety is when team members feel safe to express themselves and take interpersonal risks. But like most textbook definitions, that doesn't actually explain much, right? So when we say interpersonal risks here, we're meaning things that would invite judgment, and hence they're a risk to say it with the group. So this is everything from talking about a mistake or a failure to revealing maybe a piece about your identity that you don't necessarily know if the team will accept or not. I mean, I hope they will, right? And we are, thankfully, I think most teams and most leaders understand the importance of inclusion, but for a lot of people, it still feels like a risk to say that out. Speaking up because you disagree with the consensus. The whole team is heading towards one thing and you see things a little bit differently. It's a huge risk to go, hang on, actually, what if we went this way instead, right? Or even just sharing when people invite out ideas and they say they want out of the box thinking, like people usually don't actually want out of the box thinking. And so sharing a new idea can be a huge interpersonal risk. So all of those things are interpersonal risks because the response by the group sort of determines where you're going to end up status-wise, self-esteem-wise, and where you're going to end up trust-wise, right, with the group. And there's a real misconception when I say trust, by the way, that psychological safety equals trust. And that's not accurate. Trust is sort of part of it. But what trust does, you build trust on a team that encourages somebody to take that interpersonal risk. And then when they take the interpersonal risk, that's when, as a team, how you respond determines whether or not they continue to trust you. So there's a missing piece there. teaching the team to respond with respect when they recognize those interpersonal risks is really how you keep trust levels high and grow them over, right? So you can put everybody together, do a thing like Manual of Me, build some shared understanding, some common understanding, and that'll increase trust a little bit. Or you can all have an activity you do together that builds some bonds and people feel trusted. But then when they actually share that crazy idea, or they actually talk about their failure and their mistake and what they learned from it, et cetera, that's when trust gets tested. And if you teach people to respond with a risk, hearing your idea, I don't have to agree with your idea, but I do have to hear you out in order for you to feel heard and respected, right? Or demonstrating those sort of, my friend Joey calls them micro inclusions, those little things that you do to show people, yeah, I'm so glad you said that, or I'm so glad you told us about that in yourself, right? Those little things you do help someone feel that their risk was honored, respected, their risk was worth it. And as a result, they trust each other more. So, you said the word you use the V word at the top, vulnerability. Yeah. And that is huge. As a leader, that's probably my biggest takeaway, right? Is that sense of vulnerability if you don't have any safety on your team, because when you're doing that, you're showing the team you trust them and maybe they trust you in return. But I think a bigger thing for most teams is teaching this respect. How do we have respectful dissent and disagreement without taking it personally? Or as a leader, this is where it's really hard. How do I model respect and active listening and staying in and honoring somebody when they're disagreeing with me? In fact, my question to most leaders when I'm trying to gauge the psychological safety of their team is, when was the last time somebody disagreed with you in front of the rest of the team? Mm-hmm. And then how did it go? Because it's really hard, right? It's really easy to feel threatened when someone disagrees with you, and really hard to give them space, to give them consideration, to entertain the idea that I might be wrong. You might be right too, but to, in that moment of disagreement, keep an open mind instead of get defensive, that's really hard to do, especially the higher up you go in an organizational chart.
Absolutely. Well, and David, I really appreciate you speaking to the idea of you teach these skills within the team. And when I'm working with school teams, I talk about can we put intentional structures in place that allow us to practice this? Like, it's one thing for a leader to say, okay, everyone, it's important for us to be vulnerable, and I'll model it. But then I have to also create structures that allow us to be able to do that, where, at this meeting, we're going to start it off with everyone share one mistake you made this week and what can you learn from it, for example. That pretty easy.
Yeah, or even just rules for interaction, right? In the book, we talk about Alan Mulally and the turnaround of Ford Motor Company as a psychological safety victory. And one of the things that's not in the book, partly because Alan didn't tell me about it till after I sent him the book to read. Like, I interviewed him several times for the book, and then he told me the story later. So the longer I get from the publication of the book, the more I learn. Of course. But I guess that's true with everything. Was he set rules for how his senior leadership team was supposed to interact with each other. And one of the rules, and I love this, so I tell this to my kids now all the time, is we never make a joke at someone else's expense, because it's not funny to them, right? It might be funny to everybody, but it's not funny to them, and it undergirds how much trust they have in you now, because they revealed something about themselves to you, and then you use that to crack a joke, to put them as the center of sort of ridicule, right? So it's not funny to them. Now, the other reason this one really stands out to me is that I grew up in the Northeast of the United States. Like, I was born in Philly. I went to middle school and high school in Boston, right? If you know anything about the Northeast United States culturally, right? Like, snark is our love language, right? And busting on each other is how we show affection. And yet that doesn't work in a broad scale multicultural team, right? That can be, I moved to the South now. I live in Oklahoma, where everybody's nice even when they're mean. Like, it took me 10 years to figure out bless your heart is an insult, because everybody's so nice. So that brash style and that making jokes with other people did not work. And then I love finding that one of the keys to turning around a giant company like Ford was just simple rules on how we behave around each other.
But
we
explicit.
Never make a joke at someone else's, but explicit, to your point. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and it really stuck with me when I was reading the part around norms. And you have to understand, every team has norms, whether they explicitly stated them or left it underneath. There is a way that we operate together, and we can either leave it unattended and there'll still be norms in place, or we can make it explicit and, almost like you said, establish that these are the I've had some schools say these are our rules of engagement. These are the
Mm.
ways we agree to engage with one another, which, yeah, I think is really, really critical.
Yeah, and you know the irony is like I remember going to the first parent teacher conference of my younger son, maybe 6 7 months ago, and one of the things the teacher shared was, "Hey, here's the norms we've decided as a classroom, right?" And I'm reading through the list, and in my mind, I'm thinking like, I have two thoughts in my mind. The first is like, I know the teacher guided them towards like they're really proud of it because they as a team developed it, but not really. Like they're 10. They didn't
Yeah.
really. The teacher sort
Oh,
of guided
yeah.
them.
There was
So
some guidance.
that was my first sarcastic thought. But my second thought was, I wonder if the teachers in this school follow these rules for themselves. Like knowing that the teacher actually came up with this rule for her classroom. I wonder if all of the teachers in that school even have a similar list of rules? And if
Yep.
so, how much does it look like the rules we would ask of fourth graders? Because it probably should be pretty similar.
Yeah, pretty close. Absolutely. So I want to then jump, and maybe before I go to the third, when you're thinking through these fundamental elements, and of course, when you write a book, you have to go through a linear, but would you say we focus on common understanding first, then we go building about psychological safety, and then we get to pro-social purpose, which is the third element, or is it a little more complex than that in your mind?
It is. It's a little more complex than that. I would say when I engage with organizations, often they tell me which one is lacking, right? But sometimes they don't. And I have to tease out things like I'll ask for what's their most recent pulse survey or engagement survey or, employee experience survey, or I have to sort of tease it out. And we find the one that's most missing.
Right.
Right. And I want to start there. Right. Because first of all, you get the fastest gains. Right. But second of all, like, okay, that's a huge one. And they interact with each other. You can't really build common understanding unless you have psychological safety, a base level of it. But then you can't really improve your sense of psychological safety without a base level of common understanding. So you have to find the one that's missing the most. I will say anecdotally, pro-social purpose is almost always last.
Yeah, okay.
In that that's not last because it's the least important. It's last because I don't think they believe you when you talk about the importance of the work your team or the whole organization does until you've put the other elements in play, right? We all have examples of hearing leaders spout off a mission statement that's quickly forgotten and what have you. And I think a lot of the reason for that is that what's missing are the other two elements. And as a result, we're not really taking that one seriously. So that one ends up being last, not because it's least important, but just because it's the last one that you can build on.
Well, if we can go there, then David, let's break down for viewers and listeners pro-social purpose. What does that involve?
Everybody listening is probably already familiar with the word purpose. We're probably 15 years into the popularization of purpose. We know people want to know why they are doing what they're being asked to do. I find that the most motivating answers to why are actually who, as in specific people, who is served by the work that we're doing, right? And it's interesting, as educators, we can often think, okay, well, that's students, but it's not always students. There's also the broader impact we have on the community, et cetera. And then some of us might be in support roles where our who is actually the frontline educators. Like every role has a purpose and helps somebody else, serves somebody else, and it's different for every single person. So pro-social purpose is really about taking what is the broader organizational mission, and then how do you see your role in it? And your role is almost always through someone that you're helping, either the end user, end stakeholder or customer or student in this case, or somebody internally whose role can only be done if you're doing your role, right? I use two terms to kind of break down pro-social purpose. I use meaning and impact. Meaning here is more the org psychology definition of meaning, which is also sometimes called task salience, or task significance, meaning I can see how my role fits into the larger whole. It's not just BS work, for lack of a better term. It's not just, it's actually important. I'm not just pushing papers. So that's meaning. And then impact is that who. How often do I get the chance to see who's impacted by my work or feel that impact, et cetera. So how well the team develops that sense of meaning and impact. And what we see, it's interesting. we think about this as just a pure motivational thing. Yeah, people know who is served. They're going to be more likely to feel inspired and motivated. That's true. We also have some data that points to an increase in what are called organizational citizenship behaviors, fancy, nerdy org psych term for helping, for going above and beyond, for going outside of your published job description in order to help the team. Or the best definition I've ever heard is organizational citizenship behaviors are when we put we over me. In other words, the needs of the team and the objectives of the team over my own personal agenda and my own personal needs. This doesn't mean we burn ourselves out serving other people. I just mean that we think less about what we want to get out of a team interaction and more about what's best for the team.
Yeah, absolutely. So then how do I, as a leader, go about helping to build upon this pro-social purpose? Because I would assume a lot of it is intrinsic to individuals. How do I bring a team perspective to it where I might have individuals as part of that team that maybe don't see the same meaning or impact?
Yeah.
We'll be right back to continue this episode. I wish we had more data, said no teacher ever. Our contemporary schools have an abundance of data we can be accessing to inform decision-making from the classroom level to the school level and beyond. Data as a focal point is no longer elusive. The challenge lies in structuring and presenting it in a way that facilitates easy interpretation and actionable insights. How we organize the data matters. My name is Kurtis Hewson, lead learner and co-founder of Jigsaw Learning. In this free on-demand webinar, I'm going to be sharing with you 5 mistakes leaders make when organizing data for their teams. Access this webinar, and in addition to how to address these 5 mistakes, numerous free resources will be shared with you that you can begin using immediately. I can't wait to have you join me to ensure you aren't committing one or several of these mistakes within your own organization. And now back to our conversation.
So let me think through 2 ways to answer that, right? Because the first is, do we know it?
Yeah.
If we don't actually know it as a team, then nothing else I say helps you, right? And so my favorite way it's kind of creative and a little morbid, but my favorite way to tease out is what I call the It's a Wonderful Life test. You read it in the book, right? The movie It's a Wonderful Life, Christmas classic, even though it originally came out in July and was a total box office failure. But once it was in the public domain and it was free to show to everybody, they showed it to everybody. And it ran every Christmas and become people's Christmas tradition. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, because Die Hard is your Christmas movie, first of all, we're going to be best friends. But Second of all, the plot of the movie is essentially you have George, and George is burned out, depressed, feels like his life has no meaning, and he goes to throw himself off a bridge. But right before he does it, he meets an angel named Clarence, which, by the way, is the worst name for an angel ever, right? You have like Michael and Gabriel and Clarence. It doesn't work.
Doesn't quite fit.
Beside the point, Clarence essentially shows him what the world and his community around him would look like if he didn't exist. In other words, the whole movie is about understanding your impact on people based on observing the impact of your absence.
Right.
And that tells you what the It's a Wonderful Life test is, right? Maybe don't be so morbid as to say if we all jumped off a bridge together, but like, hey, if we all were this is pretty common for Alberta where you are. If we're all traveling to a conference that got caught in a snowstorm with no Wi-Fi, and for a week, the rest of the team couldn't communicate with us, what would happen? What would be the impact of our absence, or what would break down? Those are great hints at what your true impact in the organization is, or on end stakeholders, et cetera, is. So once you know that, now you've got your rallying cry, now you've got your who, et cetera. And so your job as a leader becomes telling stories that reinforce that idea. And my favorite piece of advice here for leaders would be to just don't even think about writing stories, think about collecting stories. Usually when you're in a leadership role, you're getting people who email you the thank yous. You're seeing the impact of the team on a regular basis, but are you saving it? Are you forwarding it on and forgetting about it? Or are you deleting it and not even sharing it and forgetting about it? I recommend keeping like a folder in your email inbox where when somebody sends you, whether it's a thank you note or a, hey, we just got the final results, great job, or a celebration, or even, for me, like I was a business school professor for 10 years. For me, I used to have a box in my office that was literally every thank you note I ever got, right? Preferably from students like after they'd graduated to see what went on and where they'd been, et cetera. those little stories of your impact can become really powerful ways to share the meaning behind what we're doing. And one of the things we know from the research is that when they come from someone else versus you as a leader, they're actually much more potent. So that's why I say, don't think about what you're going to say. Just think about how can you collect those stories and share them out on a regular basis, because they're evidence of that impact coming directly from the person impacted. And that's the most powerful thing you can share with the team.
Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming that that could be, let's say, that email that comes and says, hey, I really appreciated when you were able to come and do this, but then with the team to be able to say, this could not, even though the thank you was directed personally to me, this could not have happened without this happening from the team. Would that
Yeah.
be a type of an
Yeah.
example?
Or even when you see a story, right? It may be down to the end of the year. Let's use a public school example, right? Like you see a story in the local paper about how literacy rates improved this year, or we set an all-time average record for testing scores, or just anytime you see, it may not come directly as a thank you note, but anytime you see something in your radar that is evidence of your team's impact, just capture it, save it, drag it into a folder, process it later, or sorry, for my Canadian friend, process it later, right? I'm an American. I speak a very ugly English. Think about it later. Just get in the habit of capturing it. Because what I have met are a lot of leaders who are like, I don't know what to say. I got you, right? Anytime you see anything and your reaction is like, our work made this possible. So whether it's explicit, like a thank you note, or whether it's just a story you saw somewhere, capture it, drag it into that folder, save it. And then when you know, hey, we're doing our quarterly meeting with the whole team and I really want to be able to share, you can go back to that well, find the one that'll be the most impactful, craft it into a story and share it with them.
Yeah, nice. Love the power of story. Well, David, here we have a question that we always like asking our podcast guests, and it goes like this. In the spirit of if you knew then what you know now, what advice would you give your past self in relation to establishing and sustaining highly impactful collaborative practices in an organization?
I would probably tell former self that it is far less important to win every argument than you think it is in the moment, right? I can remember being in so many instances where I'm convinced of my own rightness. And then win or lose, you fast forward 4 or 5 years and you're like, actually, we were debating two different options and either one probably would have worked, right? Yeah. Like, you don't need to. I think it's important to have healthy debate. I think but you only have healthy debate when people have strong convictions they're willing to hold loosely, right? So argue as yours is the best idea isn't all that important. If the whole team actually is like, nope, we're going this way, that's not that big a deal in the long run than I think it is in the moment. And so I'd probably tell myself just to chill out on that, right? And have those, Bob Sutton calls them strong beliefs loosely held, which is what I'm sort of hinting at. But it's hard to remember that in the moment. And so it'd just be constant reminders to remember that in the moment of a debate, of a discussion, that the best way to make sure this stays productive is if I'm willing to concede fast.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm just making a note for myself on that. That is excellent. Strong beliefs loosely held.
Even from an interpersonal standpoint, right? Like if you're having a discussion with someone you disagree with, like we often keep talking because we want to hear the like, yeah, you know what? I do agree with you, but that's probably never going to happen, right? We ought to be arguing to the point where they go, okay, I understand.
Yeah.
And that's usually enough,
Yeah, absolutely. So David, as we're wrapping this up, love for you to be able to share out what's the best way that anyone listening to this, if they want to learn more, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm really blessed in that I've got a really weird last name that very few people have an online presence with. So if you type David Burkus into Mr. Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever your search engine of choice is, you'll probably find me. The only other person you might find is a 23-year-old Hungarian filmmaker. Or if you spell my name wrong, you'll find a 79-year-old billionaire. Both of them are not me. And it'll be pretty easy to figure that out. So you can find the one that is me and connect on whichever you want, right? If it's the website, awesome. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, et cetera, we're on all the socials. And this is a conversation that continues beyond just this. And so I'd encourage you, I'm not going to draw you to a specific place to chat. Wherever you like to keep this conversation going, I'm there. Feel free to reach out to me, ask me any questions you have, et cetera.
Well, David, I really appreciate you taking the time today to be able to join. And I know that this is going to impact a lot of thinking for leaders, and I've definitely taken notes for myself here as well. So really appreciate you being able to jump in and share your learning, your expertise. And for those that haven't already checked out the book, get the book. Lots of great strategies and practical ways to understand the science of it, but then here's something that you could do next week to get to that principle in theory. So
no, I love it. I love it. Again, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care, David. Thanks so much. Wow, such an honor to be able to connect with David and really hear his thoughts in regards to the science and research that goes along with our understanding of high-performing teams. And it struck me through the conversation that I wouldn't necessarily say these are new radical ways of thinking. It's formulating what we've heard and seen discussed before around teams. But I love how David was able to get to the intentionality of those three fundamental elements, and then being able to really give us ideas on how we as leaders can help ensure that pro-social purpose, that common understanding, and the psychological safety. I think, and we've heard this from other leaders before, but to hear it reiterated is really important to understand that we build structures in order to get to those. It's one thing to say we are going to be vulnerable in our teams, but it's one thing to say it, it's another to do it. But as leaders, we can structure things so that we can make it just regular parts of our work. Or as David says, it's opportunities to practice these things that make highly effective teams. It's almost that sports analogy of we practice so that when we get to game situations, we have already predetermined how we're going to operate in that game situation. We've taken drills, let's say, and practice the skill so that we can implement it well. And I think the same happens when we're thinking about building our cultures of collaboration, is intentionally practicing things like showing vulnerability, like being able to say, let's start off this meeting, and each one of us, we're going to share one mistake that we felt that we've made within the last month and what we've learned through that, or one setback or a failure. You hear that idea of sharing your favorite failure that we've had. Again, intentionally structuring is important for us. And I really, really love, I'm going to walk away with what David shared around having strong beliefs that are loosely held, meaning that we in that team situation don't have to be looking for the win, but we should definitely be looking for the understanding. And I like that idea of reaching a place of, I don't have to agree with you, but I do have to listen to understand what is being shared. And when we can make it really explicit, I think that's incredibly important for us. So I'm definitely taking away, even within our own organization, thinking about what would your impact be if you were not, or what impact would we experience of a team if you weren't part of our team. And I really think that's a great way to reverse engineer that understanding of what each one of us does contributes greatly to our overall success. So as always, love for you to be able to share this out with others, to like, to subscribe, do all of those things to help continue to have the podcast reach many individuals so that we can continue to reinforce the power that teams have within our organization, and really thinking purposefully about how we build those cultures of collaboration. There is references to David's book and ways to connect through his website and other social media in the show notes. We'll make sure that that's added there as well. So until next time, we wish you all the best, and please reach out if there's questions or insights that you'd like to share. Take care.
Jigsaw Learning, founded by Kurtis and Lorna Hewson, is a team of educators who work with schools, districts, and educational leaders to establish collaborative response to ensure success for all students. Because every child deserves a team.